Insulin resistance it really is an epidemic that is the single most common health disorder in the world. So first step, control your carbohydrates. That is the food that spikes insulin really the most. First of all, control carbohydrates. That is the low-hanging fruit. That ought to be step number one. Change the diet around to eliminate processed starches and sugars and focus on more whole, like truly whole carbohydrates, namely fruits and vegetables. Let most of your carbohydrates, if not all of them, come from fruits and vegetables. Very much scrutinize the grains like rice and wheat and corn. Focus on fruits and vegetables and eat them, don't drink them. If someone is just eating fruits and vegetables, they're going to be doing it the right way. So first step, control your carbohydrates. That is the food that spikes insulin really the most. It's really the only one. And then two, prioritize protein. Make sure that as you are restricting the carbohydrates, focus on high quality proteins. And Dhru, it's not a popular sentiment to elaborate on that, but that is focus on animal protein. This whole explosion of plant protein is, I don't know how else to say it, just a marketing gimmick. In every way, plant protein is inferior to animal protein. It doesn't have the kind of full complement and mix of amino acids, mitigating the benefit of that plant protein. It also, every plant protein has things in it called anti-nutrients, actual molecules that inhibit our ability to digest the protein. So we're not only getting not a great mix of protein and the amino acids, but we can't even get the ones we're eating because there are things like phytic acids, tannins, trypsin inhibitors in all of these proteins, like soy protein, pea protein. It doesn't matter. Every one of them has these anti-nutrients that block some of our ability to digest. And then one last point, these plant proteins also have high levels of heavy metals. This has been revealed through an independent group called the Clean Label Project, and they found that plant proteins were the highest offenders, having potentially toxic levels of lead and arsenic. And that's because plants naturally get enriched to some degree with minerals, with metals from the soil. That's a natural process. But we have made it unnatural by trying to get protein from something we shouldn't get protein from. Like, for example, peas. If we want to get a serving of protein from peas, we need like 1,000 peas because peas are so deficient in protein naturally. We've got to concentrate all of those amino acids to get a serving of protein. That's what we want. That's the desired outcome. The inadvertent outcome also, as we're concentrating all that stuff from the peas, is we get too much of the metals that are naturally growing into peas. Now, if someone just eats some peas, the amount of mineral they're getting is inconsequential. It's insignificant. It's nothing. It's only when we've now artificially concentrated them, now we're getting potentially dangerous levels of these metals. So prioritize protein. Make sure you're getting enough protein. And that's the best sources demonstrably are whey and egg whites, but just eggs, I would say, and then any kind of meat as well. So those are the proteins that someone should focus on. And then step number 3 is fill all remaining calories with fat. The power of dietary fat is that fat has no effect on insulin. Protein has a modest effect on its own, but fat has no effect. And in nature, those best protein sources that I just mentioned come with fat. It is a fact of nature. The best proteins come with fat, and that's a synergistic mix where fat helps the body digest and use protein better. Fat and protein is healthier and more anabolic than protein alone. So all these efforts of people to get like a protein shake and it's just like pure whey, that's unnatural. We're not meant to eat just protein without the fat. So let the fat be a natural part of the diet. And to points we made earlier, focus on animal fats and fruit fats. And the fruit fats are generally coconuts and olives and avocados. So the difference with those fats is our ancestors simply need, and even now, you just take the flesh of that fruit, not the seed, not the pit, but the flesh of it, and just squish it. You compress it and now you have the oil. Even it requires as little force as just our own body. We could just physically be stepping on the coconut or the olives, and we're getting that oil. We as a species have been eating those fats, animal fats and fruit fats, since time immemorial. We are well adapted to those. Avoid scrupulously these industrial seed oils like soybean oil, cottonseed, canola, etc. And that matters because at least in the US, and it's most certainly the same in other countries, it's just not as well measured, soybean oil is the single most commonly consumed fat in the American diet. So someone listening to this would think, well, I don't eat soybean oil. Yeah, you do. If you're eating a packaged food, it is very, very likely the fat in it is going to be from something like soybean oil, if not soybean oil itself. So fill with fat. That's rule number 3, but focus on animal and fruit fats. And then the 4th pillar is watch the clock. Don't feel the need to eat all the time. So engage in this idea of time-restricted eating or intermittent fasting. Give yourself an eating window, where you have eating, you're fasting for 20 hours in the day and you eat during the 4 or whatever. Let your body take a break from eating to help insulin stay low. And when it's time to eat, eat. And eat as much as you feel like you need to. Don't worry about the calories. That's not what that idea is based on. But just engage in some form of intermittent fasting.
Yeah, and the one caveat that I want to include inside of there, and obviously, you're deep in this space, is that there does seem to be some difference between a little bit men and women. Not that women can't enjoy the benefits of the fasting, but women with their infradian rhythm, especially in a childbearing age. And again, this is where it's like about paying attention to your body. They may not benefit the same exact extreme fast that men benefit from. So, obviously figuring that out, dialing that in. We've done a couple episodes on the topic that we'll link to in the show notes. But in general, obviously everybody recommends fasting. Just tweak it to, your body and, who you are.
Well said. Yep, well said. So anyway, those are the 4 pillars. So to kind of sum it all up, the best ways to improve insulin resistance, which is very improvable. That is very much something we can start to change within a day. You can start to improve your insulin resistance. It is lower stress, most especially through better sleep habits, and then lower the insulin through, at least the 4 recommendations that I just outlined.
Yeah, fantastic. Do you want to give so many people are talking about movement, but do you want to just give a quick reminder of why movement is so important when it comes to insulin?
Yeah. So you'd mentioned already one of the most relevant variables there, which is muscle is the main consumer of glucose. So let's let the muscle eat that glucose. Even in someone who's insulin resistant and insulin wasn't working as well at the muscle, the power or the beauty of the muscle is that it has an insulin independent channel or back door to pull in glucose. So if a muscle starts to contract, we start to work that muscle in that dynamic rhythm of contract and relax, it starts to do what insulin would do. So even though the muscle is resistant to insulin, we enable the muscle to start pulling in glucose on its own without the need of insulin. And thus, of course, if we're lowering glucose, we lower insulin better. And indeed, during the course of an exercise session, insulin comes down, and there is a demonstrable improvement in insulin sensitivity during and following the exercise. And then importantly, Dhru, I would encourage people, don't finish your exercise with a carbohydrate-rich meal. There's a study in humans to show that if someone exercises, the insulin sensitizing benefits even continue to the next day. But if at the end of that exercise session, they eat a load of carbohydrates, they undo that insulin sensitizing effect of the exercise. So very commonly, people will finish their exercise and they'll think, oh, well, now I'm going to indulge. I'm going to eat this fruit smoothie or this, starchy cereal or bread or whatever. No, don't. You're undoing much of the benefit of the exercise. The production of ketones is anathema to that. It is an antagonistic or an opposite phenomenon, where the production of ketones is by its nature reliant on catabolism. So insulin only wants to promote anabolism and inhibit catabolism. So it wants to promote the buildup and inhibit the breakdown. The production of ketones involves inherently a catabolic process, and that's because you can only make ketones from breaking down or catabolizing fats. So in the liver, when we are rapidly catabolizing fats, which happens when insulin is low, because again, if insulin's high, it doesn't want the liver to be burning anything. It wants the liver to store fat and wants the liver to store glucose as glycogen. But when insulin comes down to fasting levels, now the liver and other cells of the body are disinhibited, and now they can start breaking down and mobilizing the energy that they've been storing. And both of these processes are good, of course. I never want anyone to think that I'm implying that insulin is a villain, and so anything insulin's trying to anabolize or to grow is bad. Not at all. We have to have this dynamic process, and that's essential to aging well. But when insulin has taken a backseat and gone to fasting levels, the liver starts breaking down energy. And when insulin is down at fasting levels for a sufficiently long period of time, typically this is in the order of 16 to 20 hours, it's not able to stop burning fat. Now, I don't mean to suggest that in a negative tone. Essentially, the liver, in the absence of an insulin signal telling it to stop, just keeps burning fat almost more than the body needs the liver to be burning. And so that excess, if you will, where the liver is burning more fat than the body needs it to burn, and the fat cells are giving this out to the liver to continue to burn, then this excess is shunted. It's like a pressure valve. And it starts turning these fats that are burning, that we're breaking down, that we're catabolizing, and we start pushing them into this route of ketones. And it is essential to do this for the brain. And this is a little bit more of the why. And people will often say ketones are muscle sparing. And and there's some justification for that. We published a paper finding that actually ketones do, in fact, make muscles a little tougher against noxious stimuli. It kind of defends the muscle in a way. But their more protective effect isn't a direct effect of the ketones on the muscle. It's that if you are burning fat to make ketones, you're allowing the brain to rely on this other energy source. You're allowing the brain to be using both glucose and ketones, which it does exceptionally well. Anyone who's fasted or done a low-carb diet, the moment ketones start going up, the brain immediately starts using them, even to the point where it's getting up to 75% of its energy from ketones. So the moment the ketones come online, which is to say in the blood, the brain starts gobbling them up very greedily. And in so doing, by shifting its reliance to ketones and away from glucose for a time, it's allowing the the proteins in our muscles to stay in our muscles. Because if we started running out of fat tissue, or alternatively, we have plenty of fat, but our insulin's spiking all the time, we are never making ketones. And so now if the brain needed a lot of glucose, which it does, it will start breaking down the proteins in muscle to convert those broken amino acids, those remnants of the protein, to convert them into glucose to ensure the brain is getting all the energy it needs, and it would be just coming from glucose. So in that sense, our ability to make ketones is an effort to allow the muscle to maintain its muscle protein. We can defend the muscle. So ketones are in a way defending the muscle because, again, in the absence of ketones, the brain's reliance on glucose is going to be so high that it would start stripping the amino acids from muscle protein to convert those amino acids into glucose to help the brain get the energy. So ketones are they're filling that gap and allowing the muscle to keep its mass.
Let's talk about, you talked about and hinted towards some of the research that you guys have done and also the research that's available out there. And again, zooming in and out, which is our audience loves to do. You have such a fantastic way of explaining the science. And we also do a great job of zooming out together and saying, okay, so what does this mean? So in the context of some of these studies, and you do some great Instagram videos, please, if you're not following Dr. Ben Bikman on Instagram, you can find the link to his Instagram page. He does some great IGTVs on the recent literature that's coming out there. So let's talk about some of the studies that show that when you fuel your brain with the right foods, in this case, supplying the brain with more ketones, which usually means having more higher quality fats and lowering the amount of really sugar and processed carbohydrates, the body starts responding. So can you highlight one of these studies you've talked about before on your Instagram?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Gladly. In fact, to lay the groundwork, which is what we've done in a very practical way with our recent manuscript. So that might be the best place to start. So we recently published a paper where we had access to a gene database from human hippocampal samples. So these are human tissue donors that when they died, they donated their body to science. And we were able to, working with a group who does this, they were able to quantify all of the genes from the hippocampus of people who had died with Alzheimer's disease and people who had died without, no hint of Alzheimer's. So a control group and an Alzheimer's group. And again, this is human data. These are human genes that we're talking about. We were able to scrutinize the expression of genes involved in glucose metabolism and genes involved in ketone metabolism. And what we found is that there was a broad reduction in essentially every gene involved in glucose metabolism in the brains of the people with Alzheimer's disease. So the hippocampus had a broad, almost every gene, I think we looked at around 20 or so, the genes involved in glucose uptake into the hippocampus, genes involved in the breakdown or the burning of the glucose, all of them were down in the hippocampus of the people with Alzheimer's disease. In contrast, the genes involved, the roughly, 18 genes we looked at involved in ketone metabolism, ketone uptake and ketone burning, were almost totally normal in the hippocampus of people who had died with Alzheimer's compared with people who had died without any evidence of Alzheimer's. So this was providing a very real genetic foundation for what we already see in the literature. And now I'm relying on the work. What I'm citing now is the work of a man named Stephen Cunnane, and I invite anyone to look up his stuff. It is fascinating. He had found previously that in people with early cognitive decline, so nothing even as bad as full Alzheimer's disease, just early cognitive decline and full-blown Alzheimer's disease, that when they measured the degree to which the hippocampus was pulling in glucose and burning it was significantly down. So actually measuring glucose use was down in the people with cognitive decline. In contrast, ketone use was totally normal. There was no deficit in the brain's ability to use ketones. And he's the one who gave birth to that term, an energy gap. Now, one of the most compelling studies his group was involved with was a study based on 20-year-old women who had PCOS, who have PCOS or who do not. Now, very, very briefly, I promise this is relevant. Polycystic ovary syndrome is the most common form of infertility in women, and it is at its core a disease of too much insulin, for reasons that I won't get into at the moment. But suffice it to say, if a woman has PCOS, it is exceptionally likely that she actually has high insulin levels and is to some degree insulin resistant. What they found in these girls in their 20s, they could detect reductions in brain glucose use and mild cognitive impairment compared to another group of 20-year-old women of same body weight who didn't have any PCOS. So back to my comment earlier, how markers of insulin resistance can predict cognitive decline decades before the person's actually diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. This is one of the very best instances. And again, Stephen's group actually quantified this deficit in glucose use in the brains of those young women. So this is relevant in the long term and it's relevant in the short term, but all of it reflective of just of how foundational our understanding of metabolism is in the brain to our understanding Alzheimer's disease.
I mean, it's such a profound takeaway. And I just want to make sure that everybody really gets this, because let's contrast what you're saying, which is so profound, with the current model that we have in westernized medicine, which has been exporting all around the world. Mm-hmm. So most people think when it comes to Alzheimer's, dementia, in those two particular categories, either I have it, I have the genes, right? 23andMe has popularized, like, do I have the double alleles? Do I have the genes? Is it inside of me? Oh, Alzheimer's, dementia, it runs in my family. So I feel hopeless and I don't know, it's a crapshoot. Am I going to get it? Am I not going to get it? And they wait for us to age. And then one day we show up at the doctor's office and they say, we're starting to see some cognitive impairment. We're starting to see that you're not functioning as well. You might have Alzheimer's, and somebody walks away with a diagnosis and they feel a sense of feeling completely lack of control and
helpless.
They're a random victim of this scary disease that they have no idea how it started. So that's the current model, is one day you show up, and if you're lucky, you won't get it if there's a family history. And even if there's no family history, you might just end up with a diagnosis anyway. And what you're talking about here is years before a diagnosis would show up, there are markers. There are things that are going on in our health that are a clear predictor that we are likely to end up with this super scary and unfortunate chronic disease. So you mentioned PCOS as an example in young women, right? Polycystic ovarian syndrome, which affects a lot of people, leads to infertility. I have many friends of mine that I grew up, especially that are South Asian. We talked a little bit about this before, who have high carbohydrate, high sugar diets, very little protein. And often they were told that fat is bad. So they ate the standard Indian diet, right? Or the standard South Asian diet. And many of those women suffered and ended up getting PCOS. What are some other examples of diseases that people, especially young people, might be diagnosed with that are not Alzheimer's or dementia, but are a clear predictor that they could end up with that one day if they do not change their course?
Yeah. Well, what a great segue. Yeah. So I do hope, before I get into that, I do hope that there is a note of hopefulness in what we're talking about. My hope is that someone listening to this will feel empowered, that when they learn that their Alzheimer's disease is to a large degree, in most or many instances, based on poor metabolic health, well, that's something you can fight. You can do something about that. Being told, oh, well, you probably just have these plaques in your brain. Well, that's just a shoulder shrug and oh, great. Well, there's nothing I can do about that. But this is something you can do. So it is the good news, this paradigm shift of looking at the metabolic origins of Alzheimer's disease. Now, to look at the relevance of metabolic health and other seemingly non-metabolic pathologies, it's pretty compelling, where it's fun to note what would have been viewed just as a coincidence. For example, someone would note, okay, well, insulin resistance is the most common metabolic disorder. In fact, it's the most common disorder, full stop. But they would say insulin resistance is the most common metabolic disorder, and Alzheimer's is the most common dementia-related disorder. But they don't have anything in common. Well, of course, the truth is, as we've been elaborating, they do have very much in common. Another person would say, insulin resistance is the most common metabolic problem, and PCOS is the most common female infertility, but they don't have anything in common. Well, in fact, they do. It's foundational. And other instances of this would be reflected in, say, male infertility. The most common form of male infertility is erectile dysfunction. And in fact, it is so consistent to see those two happening together. It's beyond coincidence, though, as I'll elaborate in just a second, that some view erectile dysfunction as the earliest detectable symptom of erectile dysfunction, of insulin resistance in otherwise healthy men. So you have a guy comes in and he doesn't fit the profile of a metabolically unhealthy individual, but if he has if he has erectile dysfunction, that should ignite the suspicion that the person actually has insulin resistance. And that's because of what insulin resistance, how insulin's changing at the blood vessels. Now, in the case of polycystic ovary syndrome, that's a problem because of what the insulin's doing to the ovaries and its ability to create sex hormones appropriately to foster female fertility. In the case of the male, it has nothing to do with his testes. It has everything to do with the blood vessels. And insulin must be working appropriately. In other words, the body must be insulin sensitive for blood vessels to dilate when we want them to. Or in any way, in any of these blood vessels throughout the entire body, insulin works. And when it's working, it will promote the dilation of blood vessels. And when someone is insulin resistant, those blood vessels don't dilate. They stay constricted. And of course, that has an obvious relevance to erectile dysfunction because erection is based on the ability to dilate blood vessels and to change blood flow. Well, if you can't dilate the blood vessels because they're insulin resistant, you can't change the blood flow, and now the person has erectile dysfunction. And then just to be brief, other pathologies would be things like fatty liver disease, which is the most common liver problem in the world. That is at its core fundamentally related to high levels of insulin and insulin resistance. And then we have numerous other disorders of the skin and of the joints, et cetera, that insulin resistance plays into. So you can see why I'm such a big advocate of people seeing insulin resistance when they might not have originally, because our typical view now, which is a global view, and I appreciate that you stated it that way, because we might be tempted to say a Western view, but it is truly global now. Our view of disease would be to say you have hypertension, you have infertility, and you have diabetes. These are three disorders that are all distinct and have nothing to do with each other. And the person would open up their medicine cabinet and pull out those three medications relevant to each of those problems. But the truth of the matter is each of those problems and many, many others are in fact branches coming off the same tree. So rather than just coming and pruning the branch, knowing that it's just going to grow back, which is all that a medication is doing in these instances, let's just cut the damn tree down. Let's just acknowledge that these are all branches coming from the same tree, all manifestations of insulin resistance, to be precise. Let's address the insulin resistance. And thankfully, it is something we can address exquisitely well. Now, this is the common soil kind of hypothesis of chronic disease, which is essentially that insulin resistance is going to be causing or exacerbating virtually every chronic disease. So let's make sure we're looking at it, and then let's make sure we're improving it the best possible way.
This is incredibly powerful. And really also too, we're giving the control back to everybody who's listening or watching right now, because the biggest reminder is get excited when you find out, or we can be excited when we find out that we're part of the problem. Because as a mentor of mine used to always say, if you're part of the problem, then you're part of the solution. If these diseases happen randomly and they're just like darts against the wall and you're unfortunate and you get hit, so you get Alzheimer's, there's nothing that you can do about it. Same thing with cancer, and I've interviewed some of your friends and colleagues on this topic before. But if we realize that what we're doing today is part of the quote unquote problem that's creating these chronic diseases, then we're empowered to do something about it. And that connection is whether it's erectile dysfunction, belly fat, as you mentioned, is one of the first indicators that if there's excessive belly fat or some belly fat that's piling up around your waist, that's one of the most immediate predictors of insulin resistance. PCOS, as you mentioned, fatty liver disease. We call these things different names as human beings that are using language, but the body essentially sees them all as one. A survival mechanism that we call disease that is trying to adapt and do its best job to control the excess level of insulin and the high state of glucose that it's constantly in.
Yeah, well said. I agree. The body isn't making these divisions that we want to make, where we want to see a fertility problem versus a liver problem versus a blood vessel problem. The body is one great whole. It's all these pieces working together. All these different tissues are like cogs in a machine. And if one cog is broken, well, other cogs are going to suffer in one way or another. So yeah, I look, having that holistic view of disease now it is relevant now, but I don't want someone to think I'm a simpleton in this regard, where they roll their eyes and say, "Oh gosh, Ben sure has his favorite villain, and it's insulin resistance, and so I see insulin resistance everywhere, and that's all I'm addressing." Not at all. I'm in no way attempting to state that insulin resistance is the only relevant variable, but it is a common one. It's a common thread. Not only is it common statistically, but it's also a common or a shared origin of virtually certainly all the problems we've mentioned, and many more we haven't. Insulin is a small hormone that's produced from the pancreas. It is flowing through all of our blood right now as we listen. Unless we're a type 1 diabetic, we're making it, and it's always there. In the case of a type 1 diabetic, the life-saving therapy is insulin injections, which is a necessary part of that disease to allow the person to live a perfectly normal, healthy life. That is what insulin is. Its main effect, its classic effect, is to lower blood glucose. In other words, someone eats a meal that is rich in carbohydrates, their glucose levels will climb, and you see this very readily, of course, as you're wearing your CGM. In fact, I'm wearing mine. We see the glucose levels climb. That can't stay high for too long. If glucose stays elevated, if the body stays in a state of hyperglycemia in the high hundreds, getting to the 200s, if it were to stay there it would be lethal and it would eventually kill us. In fact, quite quickly. I mean, like within a day, potentially, if it stayed that high for too long. So insulin comes in to save the day. And again, insulin's prototypical action is to look at that high glucose, come in and basically open the doors to cells to allow the glucose to come from the blood into the cells. And mostly this is coming into the muscle. Muscle is the main consumer of the glucose at any point, even during rest, as you and I are, very sedentary now conversing. Insulin's the main consumer. Muscle is the main consumer of that glucose. So glucose comes up.
One thing that you can explain there, so for people that are listening, and we have some questions a little bit later on, why is muscle the main consumer of the glucose?
Yeah. So muscle has really by mass, because we have so much muscle, it is the highest single metabolic rate organ in the body. So it has a high demand for energy, and because it uses glucose so readily, ends up being the glucose sink. It's just the main consumer of the glucose. Now, let's kind of flip that a little bit. If we only had as much muscle as, say, we had the same same mass as our brain, but of course we have much more mass of muscle than we do brain. Brain is itself a much higher metabolic rate organ than muscle. It's just we have so much more muscle.
Our total muscle is much higher.
That's right. But if it were kind of gram for gram, the brain is several times higher than the muscle is, several times. In fact, interestingly, the kidney is several times higher than the brain, actually. So the kidney is the single highest metabolic rate organ by far. And then brain is up there too, and then muscle is lower. So just by mass and metabolic rate, muscle is the main consumer. So glucose comes up from what we've eaten. Insulin comes up to save the day. It pushes the glucose back down, then insulin comes back down, having done its job. But this paradigm is very important, and we can come back to that once we start defining insulin resistance, the glucose and the insulin. Now, that's insulin's main effect, but you touched on this in the kind of prelude to this question. Insulin does far more than that. Once again, there's nuance that is just so often ignored. I'd already mentioned the effects of insulin on fat cells, but if we extend that, it really represents the theme of insulin at every cell in the body. And I do mean every cell. Literally, every single cell in the body is responsive to insulin. There are insulin receptors on every cell, essentially little doors that only insulin can come and knock on. And having knocked on the door of the cell, it tells the cell to do something. The cell will respond to insulin. Now, because every cell has insulin receptors and every cell does different things, it's not surprising that insulin will do different things at different cells. But all of them fit into a theme, which is store energy. Anabolic, it is pull in nutrients, pull in fats, pull in amino acids, pull in glucose, and make something out of it. That's, of course, an essential process. That anabolic aspect of insulin is critical to insulin's role, which is why insulin is an essential hormone for human survival. We need that to happen. It's just when insulin is elevated too much for too long, as it is in most people these days in the US and abroad, then we're constantly telling the body to store energy, and it becomes hard to use the energy to break things down. And we have to break things down for human health, not only just to shrink a fat cell, but even like muscle cells. People don't realize that even for healthy muscle to grow and stay big, we must be building and breaking. We want to be anabolic and catabolic. It's just that the net effect is going to be more anabolic than catabolic. But if you don't have a catabolic window, the anabolic reactions stop. You can't constantly be anabolic at the muscle. You can't constantly be telling muscle to grow. In so doing, it starts to diminish the responsiveness to the growth signal. Like insulin, the muscle starts to become insulin resistant. We have to have times of breaking, and that can only breaking so-called, and by that I mean like the cellular process of autophagy. If we don't have time for the cell to break down some molecules and build them back up better than before, then it is a negative effect. We are diminishing returns to the point that we actually start losing. Even when we're still demanding that the cells are anabolic, the cells simply stop responding. And namely, that would be evidence of insulin resistance. So insulin's thematic effect throughout the body is anabolic. It is build, 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 make things. And that is, of course, essential. We need our muscles and our bones to have that anabolic signal, but it can't be incessant. There must be periods of when it stops and the cell can break down what's getting old. And the problem there, Dhru, of course, is that nowadays, because people have been told you need to eat high carb diet filled with starches and even sugars, unfortunately, and you need to eat every 2 hours or so. We're told to eat 6 mini meals per day. That means from the moment the person wakes up, they spike their glucose and the insulin follows. And, 2 or so hours later, when the insulin, the glucose is coming back down to normal, we bump it back up again. We bump it back up again. So the average person is spending every waking moment from within minutes of waking up to well past the time they've gone to bed with elevated insulin.
Because their glucose levels are high, right? So
they keep spiking. Yep.
They keep on spiking. They keep on eating. It might even be that gluten-free muffin, which is going to spike.
Oh, absolutely.
It's going to be
absolutely.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I love that you pointed that out. One of the great myths of modern processed packaged foods is that people will look at the gluten-free thing, whatever it is, and assume, oh, well, that's not going to have as much of a metabolic effect. In fact, quite the opposite. More often than not, what they've done in order to keep this gluten-free something have a similar presentation and a similar taste and feel to the gluten normal product is it will be enriched with things like tapioca starch, which gram for gram will increase blood glucose more than the wheat would have with all of its terrible gluten.
Or brown rice syrup or these other items to pump
That's
up
exactly right.
the sugar. So even people, this is why I think this podcast is very helpful for even an audience that considers themselves as healthy individuals, because there are things that in the nature of processed foods being so pervasive throughout the world, it's not just Cheetos and Doritos and Pepsi. It's actually a lot of the food by percentage at Whole Foods and other grocery stores that we shop at that we think are healthy. Now they're well-meaning and they're trying to provide options and better for you things that are there. But it is important to understand that these foods that are constantly, that we're eating, that are quote unquote healthy, when they constantly pump up our blood glucose, you're going to see higher levels of insulin. And then you hinted at it, you talked about a term, you talked about insulin resistance. So how is that higher level of insulin now related to insulin resistance in the body? And what does that actually mean?
Yeah, excellent. So now we're coming to what's at my heart and soul, professionally speaking. So insulin resistance it really is an epidemic that is the single most common health disorder in the world. In the US alone, it affects potentially up to 88% of adults. So this is a problem that is just phenomenally relevant. And it is very close levels, in some places even worse, in virtually all of the countries in the Middle East and North Africa. They have worse metabolic health than adults do in the US. China and India are very close to this. This is a problem that is just spreading around the world as what was once a so-called Western diet is really becoming the global diet, unfortunately. So just to help people appreciate just how widespread this is, insulin resistance is really, let's go back to that glucose insulin paradigm. So someone who's constantly spiking their glucose is constantly spiking their insulin. And the insulin will lag behind. So you and I are wearing our continuous glucose monitors. We'll see our glucose come up and down. Let's just say it gets back to normal within 2 hours. Insulin doesn't come down that quickly. Its effects will linger and it will then slowly come down after the glucose. So eventually the person gets to a state where this incessant stimulus with insulin starts to make the body resistant to insulin, because that is a fundamental principle of biology. Too much of something will result in a resistance to that something. So as the body is swimming in a sea of insulin, insulin's always elevated, it starts to need more and more insulin to get the same effect. But then we get to this paradigm that I said I'd come back to, where the person has normal glucose levels, but they have vastly elevated insulin. This right here is a perfect kind of textbook state of insulin resistance. Insulin is working well enough, despite needing several times more than we had before, to keep the glucose at a normal level. Unfortunately, because we look at metabolic health almost strictly through the lens of glucose control, we have the patient coming in year after year, and we see that their glucose is normal. Glucose is normal, so you're fine. You don't have any metabolic problems. But if we shifted this paradigm away from the glucose-centric model to appreciate the relevance of insulin, we would have detected 10 or 20 years earlier that the insulin is several times higher than it should be. But then we only detect the problem once the body has become so resistant to its own insulin that insulin can no longer keep glucose in check, and now the glucose starts to climb. Now we detect the problem clinically. Now we diagnose them as having some metabolic problem like type 2 diabetes. So the tragedy in continuing to focus on glucose as the primary metabolic marker is that we diagnose the problem, the true problem, far years, even decades later than we could have. But that same glucose-centric paradigm also causes us to treat problems worse. We aren't addressing the true problem. So for example, back to this paradigm of the glucose being low and insulin high, eventually the glucose is climbing. Now we detect the problem. And conventional medicine would say, well, let's just lower your glucose by any means, including pushing your insulin up to even higher levels than you could get on your own. And so we give the type 2 diabetic insulin therapy or drugs that stimulate even greater release of insulin from the pancreas. So we push the insulin up to super physiological levels, and now we drive the glucose down to normal. The evidence, the proof that that paradigm is so problematic is in the fact that when we do that with a type 2 diabetic, despite the excellent glucose control, they get fatter and sicker and die faster than they did before. And I mean it. Their risk of Alzheimer's goes up by double, relevant to the brain. Their risk of heart disease mortality triples. Their risk of cancer mortality doubles to the same degree that Alzheimer's doubles. So we are making them fatter and sicker than before, and we're doing it in the midst of much better glucose control. Because it's not the glucose, it's the insulin. So insulin resistance, again, to define it maybe more explicitly, is that insulin isn't working normally at various cells in the body, and insulin levels themselves are elevated. That is an essential aspect of true insulin resistance. Insulin is high, but it's not working the same way that it used to. Those are sort of the two pillars of insulin resistance. And then the effects are myriad. It's far beyond just being relevant to type 2 diabetes. And,
right.
And I won't...
a whole host of things inside of the book that insulin can be connected to, because I think, again, people are listening to this are like, well, I'm not really worried about type 2 diabetes and I feel like I'm pretty healthy. But You talk about erectile dysfunction. You talk about migraines, right? Let's just take those two as categories of things that a lot of people suffer from. How could insulin resistance be connected to those two as an example?
Yeah, I love that you bring those up. Yeah, in fact, there was a manuscript that mentions in the title that something like, is erectile dysfunction the earliest symptom of insulin resistance in men? And this is a function of a failure of insulin to regulate blood vessel control as well as it could before. So normally, insulin will flow across a capillary, these teeniest of the blood vessels, and tell the blood vessels to dilate. It'll tell them to get bigger. Of course, that is essential for male fertility. We have to have that insulin-induced vasodilation for a man to be able to be fertile. The failure of insulin, so as those capillaries, those little blood vessels become insulin resistant, now the blood vessels can't dilate, it can't increase blood flow, and now the man fails at fertility. His most essential event with his physiology, his erection, is no longer capable of it. But if we extend that same blood vessel observation throughout the body, we also can explain why insulin resistance is the single most common explanation for hypertension. So someone who's coming into the clinic with normal glucose levels, yet insulin resistance, and the physician indicates that the person has high blood pressure or hypertension, they will just give the person a blood pressure medication, which will control blood pressure, but it's not addressing the fundamental cause of the problem, which is the insulin resistance. If that physician, having detected hypertension, asked, I wonder what the insulin levels are, he or she would detect elevated insulin, sign of insulin resistance, and then say, let's address the insulin resistance, and that will correct the hypertension and, of course, consequently correct the erectile dysfunction. But even in women, I won't elaborate any more beyond this, the most common infertility in women is polycystic ovarian syndrome, and at its core is a disease of insulin resistance. It is a metabolic problem at her ovaries, preventing the ovaries from making the normal amount of estrogens, preventing ovulation. So infertility in men and women is fundamentally rooted in insulin resistance. And then with migraines, as we move up to the brain, this is actually the case in migraines, in epilepsy, and in Alzheimer's disease. In all three of those seemingly totally unrelated neurological disorders, central nervous system problems, is an energy deficit. Briefly, the brain has, as we noted earlier, a very high energy demand. It is an energy hog all the time. Even when we're sleeping, the brain has a surprisingly high energy demand. Because of the average diet, the global diet being high in carbohydrates and high insulin, the brain is forced to get all of its energy from glucose, virtually 100%. And we can come back to this idea later with the alternative fuel not being available, and that's ketones, but that's a bit of a shift in topic. But the brain has a high energy demand, and because of conventional eating, glucose is the only viable fuel for the brain. Some of the brain's glucose uptake will be mediated by insulin, not all of it, but insulin facilitates some of the glucose that will get to the brain to meet the brain's energy demands. But as the brain starts to become insulin resistant, that demand, that actual glucose availability is deficient. We have a little energetic gap. The brain can't meet all of its energetic needs from glucose, and thus a pathology starts to present itself. Alzheimer's disease, we can detect this, and this is like truly detectable in humans. We can detect in Alzheimer's, epilepsy, and migraines, the brain isn't getting the same amount of glucose as we see the brain getting in a control human who doesn't have one of those pathologies. And so as the brains become insulin resistant, it's preventing, again, the brain from getting its energy from glucose. And now we have a problem manifesting. But that is why if we can improve insulin sensitivity at the brain by dietary manipulation, we start to correct that problem. In the case of migraines, there are studies from the 1920s, for heaven's sakes. I mean, we're talking like almost 100 years ago. We have evidence of a physician putting patients with migraine headaches onto low carbohydrate diets. And it is profound what this physician noted in this manuscript, highlighting the effect that each individual subject, something that just doesn't really happen these days. And almost all of them, it said, upon entering ketosis, which is the state that I've been alluding to and haven't really defined yet, but basically a low-carb diet, upon adopting a low-carbohydrate diet, which is the best way to improve insulin sensitivity, the migraines cease entirely. And that's a common phenomenon where a person will go either they stop having migraines completely, or they go down by like to like a tenth of what they were before. And I've seen this even right here in my department at my university. I had a colleague who heard me elaborating on this phenomenon, and he went from having 2 serious migraines a week to having about 2 a year. And it's almost always because he indulges in something, spikes his glucose levels to a high level, and then has the migraine kind of returning. So with migraine headaches, as we see with other neurological disorders, it's likely at least part of it is at least explained by an energetic deficit. There is a gap in energy that the brain can't make up for in an insulin resistant state. That once we address the insulin resistance, we start to address that energetic gap, and then the disorder starts to improve.
And, in preparation for this interview, and I was listening to some of your other interviews, what really the aha moment for me is that there's all these things that we think of as negative inside the body, right? Diseases that we're trying to control with prescription drugs and other heavy interventions. And when we actually look at the core of insulin resistance, it's a survival mechanism, right? So insulin resistance can lead to a lot of other very negative things like migraines, infertility, all the stuff that you just mentioned, increase your risk of Alzheimer's. But the body doesn't make mistakes, right? It's doing this on purpose. This is a survival mechanism because, again, if we didn't get into insulin resistance, we would have died in, as you'd mentioned, in a matter of days. And I think when we understand that, we understand the beauty and the appreciation that our body wants to do what's right by us. Now, if we can support the body, then it doesn't have to go into this crazy survival mechanism, which leads to this whole host of diseases and issues that we all suffer with throughout our entire life.
Yeah, well said. In fact, I often say that insulin resistance is the body attempting to adapt to the unadaptable. It's trying to reach homeostasis or normal physiological function with an insult that just won't allow it to fully adapt. So I think insulin resistance is, if this perspective on the body attempting to adapt to an insult that won't let it adapt to, is best revealed in the fat cell itself. So fat cells are probably the first cell to become insulin resistant. It's the first domino to fall in this domino set of insulin resistance. And then once the fat cell falls, so to speak, it starts passing the insulin resistance to other tissues. But back to the fat cell, a fat cell becomes insulin resistant when it gets too big. When an individual fat cell has grown to about 4 or 5 times bigger than a normal fat cell, it becomes insulin resistant. It's basically telling the insulin, you want me to continue to grow. I cannot. I have reached a maximum size beyond which I will explode. So I'm going to stop listening to you. I'm going to become insulin resistant. You're telling me to continue to grow. I am now going to start leaking out fat when I shouldn't, because high insulin would prevent a fat cell from leaking or breaking down its fat to share with other cells into the blood to be used by the body. The fat cell becomes insulin resistant. As to your point, I think we can say a survival mechanism. If it gets too big, it will burst, and that will, of course, be a very harmful process to the body. It's a very messy thing when cells explode, when they undergo this kind of necrosis or this ugly death. So the fat cell becomes insulin resistant. In so doing, like I said, it starts leaking fats, and it starts leaking these pro-inflammatory proteins called cytokines that we mentioned at the very outset of our conversation. It's doing that, again, to try to survive, because one of the effects of some of these cytokines is to increase blood flow through a tissue. So the fat cell, which has gotten so big, it's become so big that it actually has a hard time getting everything it needs from the blood vessel. It's kind of too far. There are parts of the fat cell that are too far from a blood vessel. And so it's attempting to increase circulation through the fat tissue. And so once again, it's attempting to survive, but in so doing, it's spreading its sickness throughout the whole body by leaking fat and by leaking cytokines, namely inflammation, throughout the body. That is the perfect recipe to make other tissues start to become insulin resistant. So then we see the muscles, the bones becoming insulin resistant, reducing that lean mass that is so important to longevity. The liver becomes insulin resistant, and it starts producing this dyslipidemia. It's increasing triglycerides. It's reducing HDL, making a more atherogenic or a profile in the blood that is promoting heart disease. It starts to make the gonads insulin resistant, or the blood vessels, or the brain. So the fat cell is the first domino to fall. And then once it's fallen, like I said, it starts tipping into the other tissues and sharing that insulin resistance with the rest. And those cells have no option. They aren't really attempting to survive like the fat cell is. So the fat cell, we could say it's forgivable. The fat cell, it's forgivable that you became insulin resistant because you're just doing this to survive. But in so doing, it's kind of bringing the whole neighborhood down with it. It's burning down all the other homes to try to keep its own home from burning. And the muscle and the brain, there's really nothing. There's nothing physiological. There's no benefit to those tissues becoming insulin resistant. That is I guess we could say it's purely pathological. Whereas in the case of the fat cell, it's attempting to maintain physiology. It's attempting to survive. But again, in so doing, it's doing it at the expense of other cells. Stress is big and vague to the point that it's hard for someone to control their stress. There may be variables that are out of their control. So my emphasis in mentioning stress is there are always variables under our control that we need to focus on. So if someone suspects, if they hear us talking, they say, well, Ben and Dhru, my diet is great, but I still have insulin resistance. Well, then it is time to look at the other two, which is stress and inflammation. And again, both of those are big, vague ideas, but each of them also contribute in their own right to causing insulin resistance. So I mean, stress alone, and that's the main stress hormones like cortisol and epinephrine. Those are the two prototypical stress hormones. They directly cause insulin resistance in cells, rodents, and humans. Inflammation, if we just activate inflammatory pathways, independent of stress, like cortisol, independent of insulin itself, we can cause insulin resistance in cells, rodents, and humans. And so now the idea of stress, we know that cortisol and epinephrine will cause insulin resistance if they're up for too long and too high. Some of the obvious culprits are sleep. We know that sleep deprivation will increase those stress hormones, and a bad night of sleep will create insulin resistance the next day. Now, thankfully, you can reverse it as quickly as you caused it by getting good sleep. But even still, it touches on the relevance of stress as an input to insulin resistance. And then inflammation that is very relevant. In fact, that was really the focus, the almost singular focus of my postdoctoral work with Duke University 10 to 15 years ago. It was exploring the specific inflammatory pathways, the biochemical events within cells, and not even immune cells. I'm not talking about macrophages. I'm talking about fat cells and muscle cells and neurons. If you activate those inflammatory pathways, insulin resistance is going to be one of the results when it's turned on for too long. And so with inflammation, you see in people with autoimmune diseases where they have, as the autoimmunity is active, so too is the insulin resistance. And as the autoimmunity subsides, so too does the insulin resistance, and the body becomes more insulin sensitive. That those studies in humans are perhaps the most compelling to establish that connection between inflammation and insulin resistance. So when someone's hearing us talk, and again, this is the good news of this kind of metabolic theory of Alzheimer's disease, that far from being a disease that the person, as you mentioned earlier, they get that diagnosis and they walk out with this helpless hanging of the head and shuffling their feet in discouragement. They ought to say, all right, I've long known I needed to improve my lifestyle. This was the kick in the pants. I'm all in. And I would say, as the person gets all in, keep those three ideas in mind. How can you live a life that's keeping your insulin low, helping your body stay insulin sensitive? How can you keep your stress down? That's hard because there's some things we can't control, but there's almost a psychological aspect to it. If it's something you can't control, then you have to come to terms with it and help soften that stress on your body by reconciling that in your own mind. But nevertheless, control your stress. And then 3, control your inflammation. And that has more relevance than just an autoimmunity. That's the kind of heavy hammer aspect of it. But there's a fine little chisel when it comes to inflammation, which is just, are you exposing yourself to something that's causing inflammation? It can be something you're eating. There are people with genuine food sensitivities. If you're sensitive to a food, part of the response or part of the manifestation of that sensitivity is going to be inflammation. The body will mount some form of an immune response to whatever that food is that you've exposed yourself to, that your body's just ill-equipped to deal with. So that's the good news. Again, when it comes to something as seemingly helpless as Alzheimer's disease, there are 3 very powerful strategies to improve your insulin sensitivity and help, 1, reduce your risk of Alzheimer's, and then 2, perhaps even reverse course to a degree.
Yeah, and I want to talk about that coming up in here in a second. And I really appreciate you bringing in that holistic view, because it's not just diet. These other aspects play a role. And if I could double down on diet for a second, diet does also impact those things. You know, when your glucose is out of control, as anybody with the continuous glucose monitor, you know, me and you both rock Levels, Levels Health, and you're an advisor to them. we'll see that when your glucose is high, when your blood sugar is high at night, your sleep gets thrown off, right? You don't sleep as well. It's hard to really kind of get in the zone. And additionally too, we had a doctor on the podcast a naturopathic doctor who was talking about patients that get panic attacks. She said, I've never seen a patient that has a panic attack when their blood sugar is balanced. It's always when there's a deep crash. And then before that crash came a huge spike. So this is a very well-known thing, that if you're getting stressed out in your life because your blood sugar is on a roller coaster and you can't focus well, and then your body starts to get into panic mode and starts secreting more cortisol because it's saying, hey, listen, we're about to run out of food and we're going down fast. Like, you need to start really paying attention and go out there and kill something, hunt something, find something, and you need to eat now, which is why some people get hangry when their blood sugar drops really low. So these other areas are important, and we can't get there alone, and diet does impact them. So it's a little bit of both, right? Yeah. It's these other areas important, and pay attention to how diet does impact those. So going
Drew,
back to
can I elaborate?
Please.
Can I elaborate on that for just one
please.
sec? It's so interesting. It's something I would have never realized if I hadn't been wearing a CGM and using levels to monitor myself. One of the more remarkable moments came for me about probably 4 months ago. We'd been driving as a family down to southern Utah, which is just beautiful, and we were going to go mountain biking with the kids, my wife and the kids. Right near the time we were getting about to arrive, my kids, at one of the gas station stops, this is my confession, my kids had bought some little candies, and I'm all right with that. Of course, we just don't make it. It's always an exception. But they'd had this, one of my little boy had a little pack of gummy candies, and I just love gummy candies. I have an unhealthy obsession with gummy candies, and I control it. So that's my confession. I'm addicted to gummy candies. But we were getting there, and it was so warm outside in southern Utah, and kind of the desert of southern Utah, that I thought, well, these gummies are going to get all spoiled and kind of jello-y, so I'm just going to eat them. It was Mike and Ike's, the little kind of jelly bean little candies. And so I just ate most of this little box just very, very rapidly. My boy had only eaten a couple, and I thought, bomb, I'm just going to down these really quickly. Then we get out and we start biking. I start to get, I feel horrible. I'm a little shaky. My palms are sweaty. I have this profound headache. And I didn't know what was happening. It was something I'd never really felt before. And I checked my blood glucose levels, and I dropped down to about 40. And I see this huge spike when I'd eaten the candies, and this enormous drop. Well, what is so interesting about that unique state where someone has this, what's called a rebound hypoglycemia, where they eat a meal and they get a little brain fog or a little tired and lethargic. What happens in that unique state is you've spiked the glucose. Insulin has rocketed up to try to prevent it from going too high. In my case and many others, insulin overshoots it. Insulin goes too far. And for me, I think it was a combination of having eaten these and immediately getting up and moving around, where my muscles were also very greedily pulling in the glucose independent of insulin. So my glucose rocketed down, went really low. So at that moment, my brain is relatively deficient in glucose. It's not able to meet its energetic needs from glucose alone because glucose went so low so quickly. Now, a person would hear me say this and think, well, why not then just rely on ketones? But I had already wiped out my ketones by spiking up my insulin. We only ever have fairly little ketones in the blood. So this massive spike in my glucose ended up in the hour afterwards, or about 45 minutes after it happened, I end up depriving my brain of its two sources because the glucose plummeted down, getting to what was a very uncomfortably low level for me at the time. And this massive insulin spike would have deprived my brain of the ketones. So I did, in fact, have, very likely, an acute period of time, an acute moment of an energy gap. My brain was hungry, and it was essentially telling my body, hey, I need to stop things. I'm getting hungry, and if I go too hungry for too long, we're dead. So muscles liver, I need you guys to slow things down to spare some of this energy so that I can make sure I'm fed and we can continue to survive. So people who, now my instance was quite extreme. It was very profound feeling. And I just had to sit down and let it kind of work. I told my wife and the kids just kept going. I just drank water and had some salt just to try to keep my blood pressure up and just work my way through it over the next 15 minutes or so. But to a lesser, maybe more subtle degree, I think this is a common phenomenon where someone they're at work and they're trying to get the best productivity from their brain. And I understand that. That's my moneymaker. Everything I do is because of my brain. And so we're relying on our brain to be optimal. And yet when we are loading the system with these sugars and starches, we are creating a potential period of starvation. Sure, we're going to work great in that moment where the insulin spiked and the glucose is spiked, but the inevitable drop and the potential excess drop where we've gone below where we should have been, that results, of course, in a reduction, I would think, a reduction in productivity as the brain is mildly starving. So even in these short-term moments, brain energy use is profoundly relevant. And I suspect most people are putting themselves on that never-ending spike and drop that results in the brain kind of suffering.
What a great story, because it highlights this thing that is so important for us to pay attention to now, is whether you have Alzheimer's and dementia history in your family, even if, you may be thinking, okay, so I'm eating this way to one day avoid those diseases in the future. But actually, it's not just that. You may be eating this way or lowering your stress or prioritizing sleep so that you can get the maximum performance now. When you get the maximum performance now, you can show up and give love and attention to everything in life that you want to give love and attention to. And like you mentioned, yours was an extreme, but there are people that are listening today that are having their daily version of that after lunch, whether they're in the offices or working from home right now, they get a crash and they can't focus. So they reach for that coffee. Their brain's not working in the way that they want it to. What are some other examples besides, this brain fog that we're talking about? What are some of the other examples that people might be dealing with when their blood sugar's out of whack, when insulin is being overproduced? They may not have a chronic disease that has a name like PCOS, or they may not have erectile dysfunction, but what are the daily things that are going on when it comes to their brain that are examples that, hey, we got to pay attention here and start rebalancing stuff?
Yeah. In fact, two of the obvious ones, it was a bit of an oversight that I didn't mention them sooner. One is epilepsy, which is admittedly a bit of a unique situation. Of course, that doesn't afflict that many people. But a second is much more common and more common all the time, which is migraine headaches. We had been discussing Alzheimer's disease in part in a very real way as this phenomenon of brain glucose hypometabolism. So essentially, that Alzheimer's disease is in part or is born from the brain not being able to get enough energy from glucose. Well, and we can detect this in humans. We can measure, of course, like we mentioned, we can measure that brain glucose use is down in these states of cognitive decline. We see the exact same thing in epilepsy. And this could be why people with epilepsy respond so favorably to ketogenic diets, to the point that in many, many people, it's completely curative. If they suffer frequent seizures, they adhere to a ketogenic diet and they may never have another seizure again. This used to be the original treatment for epilepsy until we got so clever that we made drugs. And a drug will never work as well as a lifestyle change, and epilepsy is no exception. But also, of course, most people don't suffer from epilepsy. A lot of people suffer from migraines. Once again, people with frequent migraines have detectable reductions in brain glucose use. And for over 100 years, I think the earliest paper was in 1929, so about 100 years ago, we have reports from 1920s and 1930s of physicians taking people with migraines, frequent migraines, putting them into a ketogenic state or a ketosis, and their migraines stop entirely. I have a colleague 6 doors down. He once heard me mention this just in passing. I wasn't even talking with him. Then he comes to me a few months after that, and he says, "Ben, I've just got to tell you what's happened to me." He would get 1 to 2 debilitating migraines a week. So this would lay him out. He would miss work on occasion when it was really bad. And now he said, Ben, I heard you say this in the past 4 months or so. He said, not only have I lost about 30 pounds, but he said, I haven't had a single migraine this entire time. I mean, it has transformed the way he lives his life. And I've seen this play out in multiple other individuals, but it's just particularly fun when it happens to a cynical, skeptical scientist like I'm surrounded by, as all scientists ought to be a little skeptical. But you see this happening where Alzheimer's, similar to what we mentioned earlier, someone would look at Alzheimer's and migraines and epilepsy and say, yeah, sure, they all affect the brain, but they have nothing in common. The reality is each of them has confirmed reductions in brain glucose use. Now, whether you can turn that around or not, that's one part of it. Can you improve the brain glucose use? But even if you can't, then all the more reason to give it some ketones from time to time. Let the brain be the true hybrid engine that it wants to be. Don't keep that one fuel tank empty, the ketone tank. Give the brain the ketones. So you'd mentioned that your question, what are the other brain disorders independent of the acute brain fog or the acute sort of lapse in clear cognition? We already have Alzheimer's disease, but then we have these others like migraines, which appear to be kind of in that same vein. It's certainly in that same family of problem.
In the lines of the story that you shared earlier, another story that I have that really came out of also wearing, my continuous glucose monitor is I would always hear about how, gluten-free products, which typically are made with these, even if they're healthy, quote unquote, healthy products, they're made with these refined starches, right? Cassava, tapioca, other stuff. It's not the whole plant with all the fiber. It's these refined starches that are being used to make, or, tapioca, in some cases, some almond flour, things like that. But a lot of them these days, increasingly, a lot more people are seeing potato starch, cassava, those types of items in there, those carbohydrates. And so I knew I need to minimize those in my diet, but I thought, great, a company that I love and I still love them and I respect them for what they've done. So please don't see this as a criticism on the company, but Siete Wraps, right? They popularized this tortilla, this gluten-free tortillas that were there. And I used to make them at lunchtime. So I'd make super healthy salad, like all balanced out, everything great, some grass-fed, beef, or maybe some wild-caught salmon. And then I'd make a little tortilla wrap and I would have 4 or 5, 6 or 7. And I can remember, you know what? Let me try this on my glucose monitor, because sometimes after lunch, I would always tell people I don't like eating a big lunch because I feel totally drained and I can't focus afterwards. So I wore my glucose monitor and I had these gluten-free items, these tortilla wraps. And immediately I saw that, having done a test the last week, which I had a pizza from a place here in LA that's very well known because they import their wheat from Italy, right? So it's native wheat. It's called Pisana. And I have that, once a quarter, I want a little pizza, just like you wanted those gummy bears. You want a little taste, have a couple slices, and I'm good after that. Don't need to eat the whole pie. So I compared that to this pizza, which you'd think should skyrocket you, but it was made with native wheat. It wasn't gluten-free. And I saw that nothing had spiked my blood sugar more, and then created this chasm on the roller coaster and on the other side, this dip, which nothing had spiked it more than these gluten-free wraps that I had had. And so this is another just reminder for folks that are out there that even still, there's a lot of my friends that think that they're eating healthy and they're doing the best they have with the knowledge that's there. But if sometimes they're not paying attention or looking into these things, or actually looking at like the net carbs of items or protein powders, that are out there, they may still be on this roller coaster that's leading to this brain fog, this ability not to be able to focus. They can't concentrate. And we chalk it up to old age, or that's just me. But we were never meant to be this way. These are all new items. But, to the last point that I want to make here before I have you chime in, this is good. If this is happening to you, this is good, because it means your body is giving you a little smoke detector alarm. Just like we know the smoke detector is going off, there might be fire, or at least we should pay attention because something's burning. This is your smoke signal. This is your detector saying it's time to pay attention. We need to get serious about this matter and create a different way of life.
Yep. Yeah. Oh, for sure. Yeah. This is one of those canaries in the coal mine where when someone feels these moments, don't overlook them and wonder whether it might be a problem of what you're doing to your body and your insulin sensitivity function. It is one of the great ironies that gluten-free products, the irony to me as a guy who sees health and wellness through the lens of glucose control and insulin control, is that you've removed one of the most common offenders, which is wheat. Now, for my view, again, I don't look at wheat as a problem because of its gluten. To me, it's a problem because of what it's going to do to my glucose and insulin. But again, the irony in gluten-free products is having removed one of the great offenders, which is wheat, they've actually put in many instances, even worse offenders, which is tapioca starch and potato starch. Those will increase your glucose much more than wheat will. Now, again, maybe the person is thinking, well, I don't care because it doesn't have the gluten. That's all I care about. But you should care for all the reasons we've been elaborating on. And that really is one of the true utilities of CGMs. Because when you see what's happening to your glucose levels, you can't unsee it. And my hope is as CGMs become more common and more accessible, people they'll make their own lifestyle changes because they'll see exactly what you and I saw. They look at what's happened and they can't unsee it. So they don't have to have Dhru and Ben saying, you really got to control your carbohydrates and be smarter about them. They end up coming to those conclusions on their own, which is, of course, far more powerful because it's not someone imposing or someone encouraging you. You provide your own encouragement because once you see what those foods are doing to your glucose levels and how you feel during those changes, you can't unsee it.
Hey, YouTube, if you enjoyed what you just saw, keep watching for more great content on how to improve your brain and your life.
One of the key things that might be unique about grapes is that we kind of rarely eat them with other foods. Like we don't really pair grapes with nut butter or with yogurt even, or with oatmeal. It's kind of unusual. So you're often eating them